So we're learning Tzurba MiRabanan for Tevilas Keilim, which is a very relevant halacha. And we're up to page 186. We actually started last week on page 184. And we're up to Bala Kli. And Rav Nachman in the Gemara at the end of Avodah Zarah, which is the sugya of Tevilas Keilim, points out that what we learned from Milchemes Midjan is that when a Jew acquires ownership and possesses a kli that either belonged to a guy or was manufactured by a guy, then he's got to be tovel it. V'toher, he has to take it to a mikveh. The same mikveh that a nida is tovel in, it's got to be 40 sa. So lo shanu ela b'lekuchin. It only applies when the Jew now owns the kli. Lekuchin means it is bebailis Yisrael. It's owned now by a Jew. The fact that it was taken from a guy and transferred over to a Jew, and now the bailis, the ownership is that of a Jew, that's mechayev tvila. Ukamaisa shahoya, Rashi explains, like in the case of Midjan, that as part of the booty in the battle against Midlan, we took over these Keilim. Aval she'ulim lo. But if we borrow Keilim from the guy, then there's no need to be tovel them. Of course, we have to kasha them. If the guy used the kli, we have to do agolo, libun, and so forth, take out the blia. But let's say we get from a guy he lends us a brand new kli. It was never used, so we have no problem with blia because the guy never used the kli. If he never used the kli, then there's no balua inside the kli. So we don't have a problem of Isur v'heter. We do have a requirement of Tevilah, but only lekuchin, only if we acquire ownership and now it's under Jewish possession. In this case, you only borrowed a kli from a guy. So again, if you have a brand new kli that was manufactured and owned by a guy and you borrow it from him, there's no need for Tevilah. You could use the kli carte blanche without Tevilah. Now this would seem to give us some, let's say, good hope for restaurants. You know, very often we eat in restaurants and we have every reason to believe that the food is kosher, but we're not 100% sure, we're not convinced that the Keilim had undergone Tevilah. And the question is, are we allowed to use these Keilim? And now we're going to apply this principle. Look, when I come into a restaurant, I have no intention, nor am I able to acquire ownership on the Keilim, and therefore they have the status of she'ulim. And we said that she'ulim did not require tefillah. So when I saw this Gemara, I got very excited. However, let's just hold the breath, because we're not out in the clear yet. And why is that? Because the Shulchan Aruch, which is number 15 on the bottom of page 186, is going to tell us that Hashoel o Socher Kli Migoy Ein Ton Tefillah. While it's true that if we borrow or, for that matter, rent a Kli from a guy, it does not require Tefillah. Aval Im Yisrael Kadomei Agoy. So if I go into a Jewish Geschäft, meaning it's a restaurant that's owned by Jews, and presumably they bought Keilim from a guy, meaning the proprietor of the restaurant, we'll call him Yankel Beryl, who's Jewish, did not just rent these Keilim from the guy. The Keilim are there in a kavua way in his restaurant. So he apparently acquired ownership on it. Obviously, he's required to do the tefillah, not me as a person, a customer who's eating in his restaurant. But the Shulchan Aruch says, once the Yisrael purchased the kli from a guy, so the owner of the restaurant now owns the kli, then even if hish'ilo lechavero, so you have Ruvain who purchases a kli from John Paul Jones, and now he rents the kli to Shimon, which is exactly the case of a restaurant. The restaurant ordered Keilim, let's say, for example, glass. We'll see later that glass needs tefillah. And a lot of glass that comes to Israel is imported from France and other countries. So therefore, when the owner of the restaurant buys these Keilim, he's chayiv in Tevilah. And now if he hasn't taken the Keilim to a mikvah, but hish'ilo lechavero, he lends it or rents it to another Jew. So it went from Ruvain to Shimon. Ruvain was not tovel the Keilim, and now Shimon is told Tevilah. Shekvar nischai biyad rishon. And this Shulchan Aruch is based on Tosfos. And Tosfos says that once the chiyuv was chal biyad Ruvain, because Ruvain purchased the kli from a guy, then Shimon cannot use the kli without Tevilah, because it's kvar nischai biyad rishon, biyad Ruvain. And if we use Briska terminology here, we can explain this conceptually in a very simple way. What is the nature of a chiyuv Tevilah? Is it a chovas gavra or is it a chovas chefta? And what we're saying is that once a Jew buys the kli from a guy, it engenders a chiyuv in the chefta of the kli. The kli now needs Tevilah. So whether or not the buyer, we call him the Rishon, actually implemented his chiyuv Tevilah or he did not, the kli itself has a chiyuv Tevilah. So therefore, when the second Jew, call him Shimon, wants to borrow the kli from the first Jew, the owner of the kli, that's Reuven, he's got a chefta that requires Tevilah. And that chefta, insofar as its tone Tevilah requires Tevilah, generates an isur that we're not allowed to use the kli without Tevilah. So I got excited by the statement of Rav Nachman in the Gemara at the end of Avodah Zarah that it's only lekuchin. I'm going into a restaurant, I'm not purchasing or acquiring ownership on the Keilim, and therefore I should not be chayiv Tevilah. But it doesn't matter, because if the owner of the restaurant is a Jew, then the kli itself is toned Tevilah, even for a second Jew who does not own the kli, just borrows the kli. V'yesh misha omer, shem lo lekcha rishon litzorach su'uda. Now let's try to understand the following. When Ruvain, who owns a restaurant, purchased Keilim for his restaurant, did he have any intention to personally eat from these Keilim? Did he buy it litzorach su'uda? No. He bought it in order to make money off these Keilim by renting them to someone else, or in the context of a restaurant, by serving food in these Keilim to his clients who are coming to eat in the restaurant. However, if you take a look at the next three words in the Mechaber, again, my hopes are dashed. He says, El lachtoch klofim. The purpose of his buying the kli was not for Suda at all, not for his Suda, nor for another Jew's Suda. He bought, let's say, a knife, and this knife could be used to cut meat or other food, or it could be used to cut different objects, like klofim. Klofim are cards, let's say, so they come in a sheet, and you cut them into smaller pieces. He wants to use the knife for cutting klofim. He's not using it for Suda. And he, through his purchase and the purpose that he has for which he bought the kli, will determine whether it's a kli Suda or not. And since he bought it for the sake of lachtoch klofim and not to be used with food, he was kovea, he generates a shame on the kli, and it's not a kli Suda. It could be used for a kli Suda, but he's not intending to use it, and that's not the purpose for which he borrowed it. For which he bought it. And therefore, the kli is not toned Tevilah. But if, on the other hand, he buys these Keilim from a guy for purposes of Suda, albeit not for his Suda, but for some other Jew's Suda, because he's going to invite a Jew or he's going to rent it out to a Jew, and if he owns a restaurant, he's going to, have a client who's a Jew, that's called a kli Suda. It was designated as a kli Suda. Now, at this point, we want to raise the following question. What happens if you buy a kli from a guy and the kli is only functioning to transport the contents of the kli from the seller to the buyer. For example, I'm going to use an example here. Hopefully nobody's going to sue me for using the name of the company, but I happen to like Hellmann's mayonnaise. Anybody here like Hellmann's mayonnaise? Okay. So when I buy Hellmann's mayonnaise, I don't come into the store and he pours a glump of mayonnaise into my hands. I get it in a glass. That glass was manufactured and owned by Goyim. Now I purchase the mayonnaise and I purchase the glass jar that contains the mayonnaise as well. So the post can write, okay, look, you're not using the Hellmann's except to take the mayonnaise. So now you remove the mayonnaise. You know, you take a little bit of mayonnaise on Sunday, a little on Monday, etc., and you empty out the mayonnaise. But now you decide, after emptying out the mayonnaise, that you want to use that jar to keep food in. And now it becomes a kli suda, because you now want to use it for food. But initially, when you purchased it from the guy, your intention was not to take the glass jar because you want to use it as a kli suda. You're only using it to transport the Hellmann's from the guy to you as a buyer. So Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zichrono Livracha, wanted to be matir using the Hellmann's after you emptied it out as a kli suda, even though it's glass that was manufactured and owned by a guy. And he said the following: as long as you were using the Hellmann's mayonnaise just to remove the mayonnaise, then it was like lachtoch klofim, it was not designated as a kli suda. If, on the other hand, now, at the end of the day, you want to use it for seuda, says Reb Shlomo Zalman, an amazing chiddush, you, the Jew, are creating a kli suda. And therefore you don't need tefillah, because tefillah is only required when a guy created or sold a kli suda. If you created that kli suda, like for example, if you have Keilim that you bought here in Israel, that were manufactured here in this country by Jews, those Keilim do not require tefillah. It's only Keilim that you purchase from a guy. Says Reb Shlomo Auerbach, when you redesignate that Hellmann's mayonnaise jar as a kli suda, you've in effect created the kli suda, even though it was manufactured by a guy. And if you take a look on page 187, we have the case of a non-Jewish factory that produced Keilim. They manufactured them, and of course, if the Jew purchases those Keilim from a factory or through a middleman, but they were manufactured by Goyim, the kli needs tefillah. And now, well, the question arises, what happens if the workers who were hired by the Goyish owner of the manufacturing plant, the workers are Jewish? Again, something very common here in Israel. I don't know how common it is in Chutz La'aretz. So that the owner of the manufacturing plant may be a guy. Very, very common here in Israel. But the workers are Jewish workers. So who actually produced the Keilim? No. You need tefillah. Why? Because the owner of these Keilim is a guy. And even if the Jew was the actual manufacturer, since they're owned by the guy who owns the manufacturing plant, then they need tefillah. If, on the other hand, the owner of the factory is a Jew, the workers who are producing and manufacturing hands-on in the factory are non-Jews, you're not chayav in tefillah. Because although it was the hands of the goyim that actually produced the glass, but they never owned it. And the act of the guy to manufacture the kli is not enough to generate a chiyuv tefillah. It's got to be owned by a guy. And in this case, it was owned by a Jew. He is the proprietor and the owner of the manufacturing plant. Now, This is before the Aruch HaShulchan. Now we want to study the Aruch HaShulchan. As I mentioned to you many, many times, the Aruch HaShulchan, his name was Rav Epstein, and he was a Rav, a hands-on classic Rav back in Lita, and he wrote the Aruch HaShulchan. So we're looking now at number 16, for those who like to see it inside, which I very strongly encourage.
I have a question.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I have a question. Hold on.
I'm not sure if that's a question or it might just be.
I have a question.
Yeah, Chaim.
Like, what happens, with the case with the Helmets mayonnaise? If your intention when you went to the store to buy it was to do both, to eat the mayonnaise and to use it as a kli afterwards.
Right, that doesn't matter because it was sold to you as a jar that contains food in order to pass the food on to you so that you can take it home. Whether you decide to reuse it or not, that's irrelevant. Within the context of the sale, and again, the ownership and the sale is going to determine whether you have tefillah, then the context of the sale was to sell you mayonnaise. And that's what you're paying for. The owner of the mayonnaise is not charging you as a separate charge for the kli. There are situations in which you could have bought, let's say, olives, correct? And you could take the olives in a plastic bag, but the seller, who's non-Jewish in this case, says, you know what? I'll sell it to you together with a kli, and you'll have to pay me a couple extra, piastos, and just to own the kli. That's already a different story. Then we have to wonder what the goal of the buyer was, because in this case, the seller is saying, you're paying me for the kli, and this kli has a use above and beyond transportation. As far as transportation, to transport the olives, you can do it with a bag. But anyway, let's get back to the Aruch HaShulchan, because our time is limited. Yisrael HaMachzik Beis Charoshis, the Jew owns a factory, Sha'osim Kleis Chusus, and he produces glass. Hapolim Goyim, the workers who are actually blowing the glass, they are Goyim. So imagine in Bueno, out there in Italy, you have a Jewish owner of a glass company, but the Goyim are doing all the work. Ole Hepach. What about the reverse? What you have here is a non-Jew that owns a glass factory, and the workers are Jewish. Shemachzik Goy upolim Yisrael. Machzik here means the one who holds on to and owns the glass factory. Yesh lismoch al hamekilim. Some say that you could be mekim, and you're allowed to buy these kelim and use them without tefillah. And why is that? Because according to Aruch HaShulchan, he's saying we really don't know what generates that chiyuv tefillah. Is it the ownership, or is it the actual manufacturing? And Rabbi, therefore, in each of these two scenarios, we end up with a suffix. One side of the suffix says you're potter because the workers were Jewish. The other side of the suffix in the other scenario says you're potter because the owner was Jewish. And you're left with glass. Glass is only d'Rabbanan. The Torah prohibits use of a new kli from a guy, or for that matter, an old kli from a guy, when it's oferes and all the different metals that are listed in the pasuk, but not glass. Glass is only d'Rabbanan, and therefore the Yesh Misha Omer This first opinion, quoted in the Aruch HaShulchan, says, in these two cases, we apply the principle of Safek to Rabbanu L'Kula. You don't have to do tefillah because of a Safek. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, Lo Nehira Li Klal.
Rabbi, can I ask this question?
Yeah.
Substantially everything you buy at the supermarket is in a glass or metal container. Are they saying here that we can't buy those things because we don't know the source of who made those containers? Because otherwise, how do you buy it?
Let's rely on Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and I'll repeat it again so we have it clear. Whatever he sells you, the guy, as a kli, he's primarily selling you that which is inside the kli. The kli itself is not used for a purpose other than to transport that which is inside the kli. So you don't need tefillah. I don't care if it's glass. I don't care if it's metal. And I don't even care, says Rav Shlomo Zalman, if at the end of the day, you will reuse and designate that kli for achila purposes, because then you've created the kli. So again, buying from a non-Jewish geschäft, and the merchandise and the food is being transported to you in a kli, no problem. But what about the following case?
Now, when you say transported, that also includes storing it in your refrigerator or in your cabinet at home, because that's
Correct.
storing, it's
Excellent.
no longer transported.
Excellent. Yeah, anything that serves the purpose of the mayonnaise. Meaning you need to hold the mayonnaise because you can't hold it in your hands. So you want to put it in the fridge. You want to bring it from the store to your house. All of the above. So that's not a kli suda.
So
And
you
therefore,
only have
no problem according to Rav Shlomo Zalman.
So you only have an issue is after you use up whatever food product is in it, you decide that instead of
and there's no
away
problem.
that.
So Rav Shlomo Zalman says there's no problem. You decide after you empty it out that you want to use it for a kli suda. No tefillah is required. Okay, that ends that parsha. Now we're dealing with the Aruch HaShulchan. So we're moving on to another parsha. What is the parsha of the Aruch HaShulchan? He's talking about a manufacturing plant that's selling you a kli suda. This is not the mayonnaise case. Maybe I confused you with the Hellman's mayonnaise case. Now we're talking about buying glass. You're buying glassware for the purpose of food. The glass was produced by Jews who are working in a factory that's owned by Goyim, or alternatively, the Goyim are producing glass that's owned by a Jew. The Aruch HaShulchan says in these two cases, we have what's called a suffix. We don't know how to determine. If it's glass, that's the Rabbanan, and therefore we activate the principle of suffix to Rabbanan L'Kula. And now the Aruch HaShulchan throws it overboard. Lo nehira li klal. I don't agree with this. He says the following, that we have halacha that if you produce something, you take a raw material and you make something out of that raw material, then it's yours. You own it by virtue of the fact that you produced it. And if you know anything, lahavdil elf avdolos, about Karl Marx, who was born Jewish, he has something called alienation from the products of my labor. So this concept from Karl Marx, that I own something because I produced it, is a Jewish concept, and it's called uman kona v'shvach kli. Again, the language is not important. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, you might argue that since the Jewish owner of this factory, a glassmaking factory, is hiring Jewish workers, then those Jewish workers will acquire ownership over the kli. Or let's take the opposite scenario. Let's say the guy owns the factory. Let's say the Jew owns the factory and he hires non-Jewish workers. They are producing the kli, and they therefore have a kinyan in the kli, and they generate a chiyuv tefillah. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, that's not true. Why? because Uman Kona Vishvach Kli does not apply in a case where you are working in a factory. And we'll try to understand why as we go along. Avol bi'esek kloli, and again we're talking about a factory. Sha'osim kelim lemeos ulalofim. These are mass produced. We used to call it the assembly line, if you follow what I mean. Every kli looks exactly like the next one. There's no creative process. I'm not paying anyone as an artisan to create a new kli. In this case, everyone would agree that ein uman kona v'shvach kli. Those workers in a factory that are producing daily hundreds, if not thousands of Keilim, are not in any way owners of the Keilim. The ownership of the Kli is the Baal Ha'esek, meaning the owner of the factory. Ve'al shmo nikra Keilim. Hapolim einam etzlo ela kmo schirei yom. They're just workers that are being paid for a day's work. That's all. They don't have any kinyan, any ownership rights in the objects, in this case, the glassware that they produced. If the owner of the company is Jewish, even though he's hiring non-Jewish workers, they don't own any part at all, not even a segment, not even a pruta's worth of these Keilim. Therefore, p'tur mitfila af kli matechos, even if they're Keilim that would normally require tefillah doraisa, because there was no ownership on the part of the goyim. So this is not a suffix. We will not be machmir because it's a kli matechos. Even though the Jew hires non-Jewish workers, no chiyuv tefillah whatsoever. If the company is owned by a goy, v'apolim Yisraelim, af bekli zchuches kai b'tefillah b'bracha. The Yesh Misha Kosav, the opinion that was quoted here by the Aruch HaShulchan in the opening line, which makes it dependent upon whether it's metal Keilim and is a chiyuv d'oraisa, or it's glassware, which is only a chiyuv d'rabbanan, not correct. Strike it off the record, says the Aruch HaShulchan. It only depends upon one factor. Who owns the factory? The workers did not own any part of the glass. Even though Uman Kona V'Shvach Keli, that doesn't apply if he's not an Uman. He's not shaping and designing the Kli in his handiwork. He's producing massive amount of Keilim. One looks exactly identical to the other. And therefore, it's the owner of the Geschäft who will determine ownership. If the owner of the Geschäft is a Yisrael, even though he's hiring non-Jewish workers who produce the glass, you're not chayav tefillah. If the ownership of the Geschäft is a guy, even though he hires Jewish workers, you're chayav tefillah. And let's go back. There's no difference, says the Aruch HaShulchan, between kli matechos and kli zchuches. If the owner of the Geschäft is a Jew, even if the utensils that are being produced and manufactured by goyim who are hired by this Jew are metal Keilim, you're not chayav tefillah. Because the goyim who are working in the factory have no ownership rights at all on the Keilim. If, on the other hand, the company is owned by a guy, then even if his workers are Jewish, and even if the Keilim are klei zchuches, they're a glassware, since the manufacturing plant is owned by a guy, he owns the Keilim, and you're chayav in tefillah. And that is the conclusion. You'll see here in the Aruch HaShulchan, l'cheik shekona kli matechos o kli zchuches arch leda miu bala isa. So whether you're buying metal Keilim or glassware, you got to find out, you got to determine who owns the manufacturing plant. Now, we haven't discussed the case of shutfis. What happens if you have a manufacturing plant that's owned by both a Jew and a guy in partnership? Do we say that since it's partially owned by a guy, therefore it needs tefillah? Or do we say no, since it's partially owned by a Jew, it does not need tefillah? And that's going to be a discussion that Bali Neder will get to. You should know that when we talk about partnership, there's a fundamental difference between stocks and classic partnership. Classic partnership means that you own part, I own part, we can even add a third and a fourth and a fifth. There are many, many partners. But there's no corporate ownership, as opposed to a stock that's sold on the market. That's called corporate ownership. And you'll know that in various countries, there are legal terminologies for corporate ownership, LTD and all these different names and so forth and so on. In Israel, it's called Ba'am. When there's a corporate ownership, the halacha changes entirely. No one has ownership over the Keilim that are produced by that factory if the factory is owned by a corporate entity. And if no one owns it and there's no private ownership, there's no chiyuv tefillah. And the truth is that even if you have a stock, and I would tell you that 99% of the owners of the stockholders, as we call them, are goyim, it wouldn't have any impact. And this leads us to a different shaila, which we're not going to talk about now, and that is whether a Jew can actually buy ownership in a company that's producing basar b'cholim, like McDonald's, I'm talking about McDonald's in America, Trafe McDonald's, or what is that, Southern Fried Chicken? What's that company called? I forget the name of it. Anyway. So, what do you say? Okay. Now we get to Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. We're now up to number 17, and he's saying the following. What happens if I go into a store and I don't know who's the owner of the store? I have doubts as to whether or not the owner of the store is a Jew or a non-Jew. If I can clarify that, ma tovu ma noim. And the Yalkut Yosef says that it depends on rov. Whenever I buy a kli, I ask myself, are most of the companies that are producing that kli within the vicinity owned by Jews or by goyim? If I can determine that although there are non-Jewish factories that are producing glass and selling them on the open market, but most of the factories from which I could possibly buy these Keilim are owned by Jews, like for example here in Eretz Yisrael, even though I'm not sure that this particular kli came from a factory that was owned by a Jew, I don't need tefillah. Why? Because, says Rav Ovadia, we have a principle called kol de parish miruba parish. And I'm going to assume it came from a rov. Here I get very confused, which I don't want to get into now because I don't want to confuse you. But we have a different principle that lechora should apply here, and that's kol kavua kemechtzal mechtzedam. But again, I don't want to confuse you. Rav Ovadia Yosef is applying the statistical rov, and therefore I don't have to worry about the kli. Now, if a Jew owns a kli, sells it to a guy, and then buys it back from the guy, he needs tefillah. Even though initially it was owned by a Jew, the very moment it becomes owned by a guy, it needs tefillah. Of course, the guy is not chayiv in tefillah, but if he sells the kli back to you or to some other Jew, then it's chayiv in tefillah. And that's what you'll see here in the Shulchan Aruch number 18. And all of what we're learning is in Hilchas Tevilas Keilim and Yoredei Simon Kufchav, Yisrael shemochar kli legoy v'chazav l'lokcho bimenu. So the Jew sold a kli to a guy, and then he bought it back. It needs tefillah. Now, some people mistakenly think that when they sell their chametz before Pesach to the guy, they sell the Keilim that have a bliya of chametz as well. Bad mistake. Because then after Pesach, when the rabbi of the community buys back the Keilim from the guy, then it's a case of a Jew who sold Keilim to a guy and now bought them back, and it needs tefillah. Could you imagine? You're going to have to do tefillah on all your chametz Keilim, lo na'in. So therefore, we assume that the mechira does not count or encompass the Keilim, it only encompasses the bliya, the chametz that's in the Keilim, but not the kli itself. And now we learn the Pischei Tshiva. And I called Tshiva deliberately because he was Hungarian. Anyway, he says the following: Hamocher yoros ligoy b'erev Pesach mishum chametz tzarech tefillah achar Pesach. If he sells not only the chametz, but also the chametz Keilim, then when he buys it back after Pesach, he needs tefillah. And therefore, he says, mutav shelo lemochra. Be very careful not to sell your Keilim to the guy. And now we want to look at the Ramah on the bottom of page 187. What do we do, as I mentioned earlier, in the case where you have a kli that's owned b'shutfis, a partnership of both a Jew and a non-Jew? So the Ramah paskins, Yisrael v'goy shekano, kli b'shutfis, they both bought a kli as partners, ein tzarech tefillah. The fact that the guy owns part of the kli is not enough to generate a chiyuv tefillah. Either the guy owns the entire kli, or many goyim in partnership, or it's partially owned by a Jew, and if it's partially owned by a Jew, it's potter from tefillah. Okay, what is the kli made of? What are the materials? So if you take a look on page 188, number 21, we're going to differentiate between kli matechos, which are doraisa, and kli zchuchis, glassware, which is only derabbanan. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef zavin mana de marda migoy. Okay, so he bought a kli from a guy Savalat Bila, and he thought he has to be matfil. And Amalei Ahura Abonim Rabbi Yaakov Shmei L'didim and Farshle Minid Rabbi Yochanan kli mateches amurim beparsha. So the kli that was purchased by Rabbi Yitzchak from a guy was not made of any metal whatsoever. But Omer of Ashi, let's say it was not made of metal, but it was made of glass. Hani klei zchuchis hoil v'chi nishbu lehem yesh lam takana ki kli mateches dam. So for this statement of Rav Ashi, we have to learn a little bit about the manufacturing of glassware. We need a demonstration. But basically what you do is you pour molten glass into a hot, like almost like a furnace, and the glaze becomes glass. What that means is that if you take a glass bowl, or whatever it might be, and you smash it, you can actually pick up the pieces of glass and put it back into the furnace. That's not something you can do with plastic. If the plastic breaks, then yiskadol v'yiskadish, say kaddish, that's it. But glass can be remanufactured even if it's broken. And that makes it similar to a kli matechos. Because again, the process by which you form a kli from natural metal is through the heating process. And even if you had a metal kli which broke, you can reheat the metal and reform the kli. And glass, therefore, has a certain striking similarity to metalware. And the Rabbanan therefore said that a kli zchuchos needs needs Tevilah. Now we have the case of kunya. What's kunya? Kunya is a kli that has two layers in it. One layer is metal, and the other layer is not metal. Like, for example, let's say you, what's the word I want to use? Well, the word layer, I think, could also be used as a verb, if I'm not mistaken. What's the verb of layering something? I don't know. We'll call it to layer. I don't know. I hope I'm not making up a word. So let's say you have a kli that's made of mateches, and you layer the inside of the kli with, let's say, glass. So the basic structure of the kli is metal. But the food is going to go into the glass because the glass is a layer on top of the metal. So Miman of Shach, in that case, you'd need Tevilah, but the question is, do you need Tevilah d'oraisa d'Rabbanan? And the Gemara quotes Machlokes, Chad Omer kitchilasa, Chad Omer kisofa. According to one man, we look at the original kli before you added the layer on top, because that's the essence or the fundamental element in the kli. And according to another man, it depends on the layer on top, because that's where you eat from. Now, this becomes very relevant, this machlokes, in our time, in contemporary life. Earthenware is not chayiv in Tevilah. So if you make a kli, you make a utensil out of, let's say, earth or clay or concrete of that, or things of that sort, it's not a metal kli and it's not a glass kli. It's not chayiv, not in Tevilah d'oraisa, not in Tevilah d'Rabbanan. But let's say you take this earthenware kli and then you layer down on top of the inside of the kli a layer of glass, for example, or metal. And this becomes the issue of earthenware vessels in our contemporary life. Again, I'm going out of Olivia, all earthenware Keilim in our contemporary life are kunya. They have a layer of glass. Again, if you're interested in taking pottery, right? I'm trying to remember. There's a place called Kad V'Chomer. Where is that? I don't remember right now. Kad V'Chomer. I think it's here in Yerushalayim. But I think there's a place that we took the kids once in Toronto also, where they make pottery and mosaics and things like that. Oh, we'll have to ask the children, I see. So you could make, in theory, an earthenware kli today, but when you go to the store and you buy an earthenware kli, you have to realize that it's made with both earthenware and with glass.
It's glazed.
It's glazed, and therefore it's called kunya. So I want to tell you a story about one of my Rebbeim, may rest in peace, Rav Nisan Alpert, Ol B'Shalom. My friend Alan was taking his earthenware keilim to the mikveh to be tovel them. And somehow, either he called up Rav Alpert or Rav Alpert met him or something, and he explained to Rav Alpert that he was taking this earthenware keilim to the mikveh. He was not going to make a brach on it because we have machlokes whether kunya is chayiv and Tevilah or not, so we leave out the brach. And Rabbi Alpert basically laughed him out. He said, "You're wrong. This is not kunya. Kunya and our contemporary manufacture of glassware are two separate things, of earthenware are two separate things. In the days of Chazal, they actually made a kli out of Adama, which is called earthenware, but they actually added an entire layer of glass on the inside of the kli. That's not what our earthenware is. our earthenware in the heating process is a mixture of glass and earth. They actually mix up the two ingredients when they produce the kli. And the basic ingredient is earthenware. They add glass, and that strengthens the kli, but that's not the fundamental element in the kli, which is actually earth. And therefore, Rav Alpert Paskin, that there's not even a need l'chumra of taking these Keilim for Tevilah. I wish I could give you an example of it. But you know what I mean. You take all of our earthenware Keilim and you give it a bang with a spoon, you'll hear the glass, right? Okay, that's as far as kunya is concerned. And if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, you'll see Rabbi Alpert's interpretation is meduyak heitev in the language of Shulchan Aruch on the bottom of 188, because when he says Keilim hamitzupim bi'ever mibifnim, mitzupim means not that they created it with a mixture of aver, which is a kind of lead, but rather they added lead as a separate layer. And they need tefillah. However, the Ramah says you don't make a bracha on it, fine. Excellent. Yeah. Well, what is the name of that company, Bobby? I can't hear you.
This one particularly?
Yeah, I'm just curious because
this one I think is called
it's not written on the bottom of the quote.
Denby. Called Denby. But
all right.
But there's a million
a million companies.
Yeah, it's got a glazing on it, but it's really made out of
earthenware. Yeah,
earthenware.
Okay, then let's just wrap it up for today with number 23, which is on page 189. The Rambam says that im lokach kli eitz o kli avonim, if you purchased a wooden kli or a kli, a utensil that's made out of stone, meidiach o martiach v'eino tzorich lahatbil. So it means that if there's any bli of isur, get rid of the bli of the isur. If it's only surface level cold blia, then just wash it off. You may need a more serious hechsher, which is called martiach, but it doesn't need tefillah. And the reason for that is because this is not a kli mateches nor a kli schupus. Now, just for a moment, let's fast forward to page 194 and just see a quick overview of what we learned today. And Bli Neder, remind me that we want to finish this up next week with 189 and beyond. He says the following. Number one, almost all the Rishonim agree that Tevilas Keilim is Doraisa. There are one or two exceptions. And according to the Yeshuas Yaakov, which we saw last week, you're not allowed to use a kli that requires tevilah. If food substances come in contact with the kli that needs tevilah, they don't become usher. It's not a blia. The reason for tevilah, as we said last week, was to take a kedusha of guy and be megayer the kli, so to speak, and upgrade it to the kedusha of Yisrael. Then we discuss the ownership of the kli. If you buy a kli from a guy or you receive a gift from a guy, you're chayv in tefillah. If you borrow a kli from a guy, you're potter. And so too, if you rent a kli from a guy, you're potter. The Aruch HaShulchan says that with regard to manufacturing companies, then it all depends on who owns the company. And it matters not whether you're talking about a kli mateches or a kli zchukas. Rav Vad Yosef says that if you don't know who owns the company, then you use rov, and depending on rov, you'll decide whether you need Tevilah or not. Shulchan Aruch says that if Yisrael sells a kli to a guy and then he buys it back, he needs Tevilah. Therefore, the Pischei Tshuva says, be careful not to sell your Keilim to a guy before Pesach. And finally, the Ramah says that if there's shutfis, you don't need Tevilah. If it's a kli mateches, you need Tevilah d'oraisa, kli zchukas d'rabbanon. And if it's a kli cheres, that's earthenware, that's mitzupa zav, we have a machlokes, and therefore we'll do Tevilah without a bracha. But that's only if you added a layer of glass. But if the glass was added to the original manufacturing, then if it's only the miut and the rove of the kli is earthenware, it does not need Tevilah.
Okay.
We'll just end by reiterating what we said in the name of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that if you buy food from a guy and he gives you the food inside a kli, that's not called a kli suda. And even after you empty out the kli of its contents, and now you want to designate it for suda, that, says Rav Shlomo Zalman, means that the Jew created the kli and therefore does not need Tevilah. Okay, then? So it's nice to see you, and I don't know what happened to Joe today, but if you see him...
He's away.
Oh, right. I think he told me he was going somewhere very far away.
He's in Denver.
Denver, wow. Denver is like the other end of the world. They're on a different clock. I don't know.
Are we going to come back to publicly owned companies?
I can give you a whole shear on that if you like, but it's relevant. It's relevant to Basa B'chalav, really. That's the most important question. Like, if you want to buy, into a publicly owned company that sells Basa B'chalav. I gave the example of
McDonald's.
What's it called, Kentucky Fried Chicken or McDonald's or those kind of companies. And you're getting a profit from their sale of Basa B'chalav, that's a serious issue. What you have to do there, you have to create a contract according to which you will get the profits of X and Y, but not of Z. And that's what we call harama. Harama meaning, where we find a way somehow within the halakhic system to avoid an Issa.
Similar to Shabbos earnings.
Correct. Shabbos earnings, you don't want to earn from Chil Shabbos, you make a contract. And there are experts today who know how to formulate the contract with a lawyer's, seal on it and approval.
But Tevilas Keilim, it doesn't come into play. In other words, a public company, if I buy a Keilim from a public company, do I have to toivel it? Because I assume, does that come up?
It all depends on the issue of shutfis. We say that according to the Ramah, if there's shutfis of a guy together with a Jew, but in a case of a public company, I would assume that there are Jews that own part of the company. Is that not a fair assumption? If, let's say, you had a company that was 100% owned by Goyim and it produced Keilim for Seudah, then you have to see exactly how to define corporate ownership. Is it that Ruvain, I shouldn't say Ruvain because it's owned by Goyim, but let's say John and Jimmy and Paul, they each have an ownership, or no? You see, I don't know much about law, but I do know this. It's very difficult, if at all possible, to sue John, Jim, Larry, or Christopher in a case where the company was at fault. Let's say, for example, they sold you a Pepsi Cola bottle and it burst and somebody got very seriously injured. It's very difficult to sue Larry, John, or Paul. You can sue the company because the company has a certain element of ownership, but that's not the ownership of Shutfis. It's a separate ownership. And if you'd like, we can really research this and maybe give a share on this topic. Just remind me, because otherwise I wanted to finish up on Tevilas Keilim.
Yeah, that's for that. Okay, shkayach.
Okay, then. So we'll stop here.
Are there handouts for next week? Or still the same set of handouts?
We still have these pages. I'm going to look it over and see if we have room to add some pages, and I'll let you know. Okay
you.
then?
Bye.
Call it two. Bye-bye.